The stagecoach groaned as it crawled through the last ridge before Redstone, Montana, snow thick as wool draping the land in silence. Inside, Clara Emmett cradled her carpet bag like it held her bones, stiff fingers buried in worn leather handles. A single strand of hair, too stubborn to be pinned back, clung to the sweat on her temple despite the cold. Her boots had soaked through long ago. The driver didn't speak as he handed down her belongings. One trunk, one bag, one pair of boots to scuff to shine. The street was half ice, half slush. Men with calloused hands glanced her way but said nothing. Their eyes flicked down and away. The clapboard church stood taller than anything else in town, except the mountain. She walked toward it slowly, past the saloon where someone spat tobacco too close to her hem, past the mercantile where a woman inside paused mid-sweep to stare. Clara's hope had been stitched together with the promise of shelter. A letter from preacher Amos Bly, scrawled in ink smudged with scripture and suggestion. God forgives all who seek to begin again. She had believed it, but when she stood on the church steps, the door didn't open. She knocked once, then twice. The wind stung her cheeks, her knuckles ached. Finally, the door creaked open and there he was, the preacher himself, tall, bearded, wearing his faith like armor. His eyes dropped to her bodice, to the bruising near her collarbone. Then lower. Clara flinched, the weight of his stare more chilling than the wind. I'm not sure this town is meant for women with complicated pasts, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. She swallowed. You wrote to me. You said I'd be safe here. I wrote in good faith, he muttered. But a woman like you might unsettle the flock. There are children, wives, good people trying to keep their peace. She waited. Nothing more came. The door closed before she could reply. Behind her, the snow fell soft and endless. Clara did not cry. She picked up her bag again. Her fingers bled where the cracked skin split along the seam of the handle. But she did not cry. The road stretched ahead, crooked and unkind. Somewhere out there, she'd find a place not given but taken with quiet resolve. And still, no one looked back. The sun rose the next morning without ceremony, just a pale disk behind a veil of frozen mist. Clara woke in a toolshed behind the livery stable, curled beneath her threadbare shawl, the wool stiff with frost where her breath had gathered overnight. The hay beneath her rustled when she moved, stiff and sharp, but better than snow. And no one had asked where she'd gone after the preacher turned her out. And no one had offered her a place to stay, either. She made herself small during daylight, ducking behind barrels, slipping through alleys, waiting for kitchen doors to open and the scent of boiling potatoes to drift out. Her hands moved quick. When scraps were left unattended, a crust of bread here, a bruised apple there. Hunger had a way of teaching elegance. By the third day, she paid a boy to fetch her water. The coins had once been sewn into her hem, now damp and unraveling. But she gave them anyway, because thirst would strip a woman faster than any man could. On the fourth day, it snowed again. She walked the town's edge, studying each building, counting who came and went. The general store buzzed with warmth and light. She stayed near the back door, inhaling the smell of dried herbs and smoked pork, waiting for someone to toss the day's sweepings into the snow. At the seamstress's shop, she lingered too long and earned a hiss through the door. Go on now. Ain't nothing here for you. She didn't answer. There was a dignity in silence that words could not afford. Each night she returned to the shed, half hoping the door might be bolted, half hoping it wouldn't. Each night it creaked open the same way, empty and waiting. In its darkness, she spoke only to herself. You are not what they say. You are not what he did. You are not done. The bruises on her body had begun to yellow, but the ones inside her, those were slower, heavier. The kind a woman carries in her marrow. Still, she stitched her shawl back together by firelight, a quiet promise to herself that her hands still worked, that something in her could still mend. She survived that way, not out of pride, but out of something quieter and far more dangerous. The sewing room smelled of wax and starch. Bolts of muslin leaned like tired soldiers against the wall, and spools of thread sat in uneven rows by the window, catching the morning light. Clara stood just inside the doorway, shawl clutched in both hands, her voice a careful thread. I can stitch hems, take in bodices, patch trousers neat enough you'd think they were new. Mrs. Danning, the town's seamstress, didn't answer. Right away, her spectacles hung crooked at the end of her nose, and her lips pressed thin as she eyed Clara not with curiosity, but with calculation. You got nimble hands? She asked finally. Clara nodded. Quiet tongue? Another nod. Fine. There's a pile of mending by the stove. If it comes back worse than it left, you won't come back. That was all the welcome she got. She worked on a stool by the fire, the wood creaking beneath her as she leaned close to her stitches. Her fingers moved carefully, guided more by memory than sight. Linen tore differently than cotton. Men's coats held the scent of smoke and soil. Women's blouses carried whispers of lilac and starch. She didn't mind. Fabric never judged, but the women did. They came and went, casting glances like knives. One whispered to another near the doorway just loud enough for Clara to hear. That's her. The one the preacher turned away. The words weren't cruel, just cold. Clara said nothing. Her needle didn't falter. At dusk, Mrs. Danning paid her with 2 coins and a hard roll wrapped in wax paper. Don't expect more, she muttered, but her tone was almost soft. Each day after, Clara returned never invited, never sent away. She kept to herself, even as the whispers deepened. Ruined woman, trouble wrapped in a quiet face. Still, the seams she stitched held strong. On Sundays, she walked alone to the far edge of town, where the fields began and silence lived. There, she read from a tattered book of psalms she kept folded in her coat. Not for God, not anymore, but for rhythm, for something steady. Her name wasn't spoken with kindness in Redstone, not yet, but her hands had found work, and her silence had begun to grow roots. The first time she noticed him noticing her, it was over a bolt of calico. Clara stood in the general store, eyeing the faded remnants in the discount bin, mostly scraps too short for dresses, but enough for lining or patches. She ran her fingers along a length of soft blue cotton, worn at the edges like something once loved. Behind the counter, the man leaned forward without speaking. He was not tall, not the kind of broad that took up space, but there was something in the way he held still, like a tree that didn't rattle in the wind. His name was Elijah Quinn. She'd heard it murmured once or twice. He ran the store now, after his brother drowned in the spring thaw. Folks said little about him. A quiet man who kept to his work, widowless, though not for lack of offers. Clara waited for him to ask her what she wanted. He didn't. Instead, he reached slowly under the counter, pulled out a tin box, and placed it on the surface between them. More remnants in here, he said, voice steady. Good for mending. She looked at him, really looked, and found no judgment in his eyes, no pity either, just a calm that startled her more than cruelty ever had. She nodded, barely, and opened the tin. Inside were pieces someone had taken the time to fold, each scrap a small offering. A few were soft wool, one still smelled faintly of lemon soap. She picked 2 and placed a coin beside the tin. Elijah didn't touch it. Don't take coin for leftovers, he said. Her fingers curled back around the coin, hesitant. I don't need charity. His eyes met hers. It's not charity. It's cloth. Something in her wanted to argue, but she didn't. Not because she agreed, but because something warmer than pride stirred in her chest. She folded the fabric slowly, carefully, as if it mattered. As she turned to leave, he said nothing more. Didn't watch her walk away. But the next time she came, the tin was already out on the counter. By late February, the snow began to loosen its grip on the rooftops, and icicles wept into tin pails left beneath the eaves. The thaw came slow, but it came just like the thread between Clara and Elijah, drawn tight not by words, but by the spaces between them. She visited the store every few days, always around the same hour, never staying long. She bought sugar in small sacks, buttons one at a time. She never asked for help carrying her parcels. Elijah never offered. Instead, he learned the rhythm of her silence. He stopped saying things like anything else, or need twine for that. He simply placed the twine beside the bundle. If her fingers trembled sometimes, they did. He looked away until they stilled. One afternoon, Clara arrived with a length of torn muslin pressed to her side. A small red stain bloomed near her ribs. She didn't speak, just placed it on the counter with a spool of matching thread. Elijah glanced down, then reached slowly for a box behind the shelf. Iodine, he said, setting it down. For the cut. She blinked. I didn't ask. He nodded once. I didn't say you did. They stood there like that, words folded tight between them. Then, as if sensing her next protest, he added, I keep it behind the shelf so folks won't steal it. You're not most folks. It wasn't kindness in his voice. It was steadiness. And that, somehow, felt like more. She took the iodine and the thread, left the coin. He didn't touch it until she was gone. The next morning, She left something on the store counter before he opened a small swatch of stitched linen, delicate needlework forming the shape of a fir tree, edges frayed but careful. She didn't wait to see if he found it, but when she returned 2 days later, it was gone, and the tin of fabric scraps now sat on a clean cloth, newly folded. She ran her fingers along the tin's edge, then looked up. Elijah met her eyes, just once, just enough and no one else in the town would have seen it. But something had passed between them, a quiet thread, stitched strong. The first tart took her half a morning to make, not for lack of skill. Clara had baked before, in kitchens far away, long ago, back when someone still called her daughter. But her hands were out of practice, and the wood stove in Mrs. Danning's back room burned uneven. She knelt beside it anyway, coaxing the flame, checking the crust until it browned just so. She wrapped it in clean cloth, tied with faded thread from the store tin. No note, no signature, just the tart itself. Blackberry, wild picked the summer before and preserved in a jar she'd bartered for with stitched handkerchiefs. She left it on the general store counter before sunrise. By the time Elijah unlocked the front door, she was already gone, the only trace of her passing a trail of boot prints in the fresh dusting of snow. That evening, when she returned for flour and matches, the tart was gone. He didn't mention it, neither did she, but when he handed her the flour, she noticed something folded between the paper layers, a handkerchief. Her own stitching, the same fir tree pattern, but now backed with a new scrap of blue cotton. He'd lined it. She looked up slowly. Elijah leaned against the shelf, arms crossed, not smiling, not expectant, just present. Figured it ought to last, he said. Wasn't right, fraying like that. Clara's fingers curled around the bundle. Her throat tightened, too full for speech. She nodded once, just once. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky above Redstone was wide and breathless, the stars so clear it felt like you could reach up and gather them. That night, she sewed by lamplight, in her borrowed corner of the seamstress's room, but her hands moved softer now, steadier. Something had shifted, not enough to name, but enough to feel. In a town that still whispered her shame behind drawn curtains, one man had received her offering without question and returned it stronger. And for the first time in a long, Clara allowed herself one quiet smile, not for anyone else, just for her. Spring arrived in Redstone with a hesitant hand. The thaw left, the streets slushy and the air thick with wood smoke and meltwater. Crocuses pushed up near the chapel fence, brave and pale. Life returned in slow measures, and with it came the first Sunday market of the season. Clara stood at the edge of it, all just beyond the barrels of onions and molasses jars. Her basket empty but her shoulders straight. She hadn't meant to come, but her legs had brought her here anyway. Vendors lined the main road. Townswomen bartered for seed. Children darted through dust and puddles. The preacher stood near the chapel doors, speaking softly to a group of wives. His eyes brushed over Clara once and then moved on. Good, she thought. Let him look. Let him turn away. She drifted toward the far end of the market, where the noise thinned. A table of mended tools caught her eye, old handles sanded smooth, iron sharpened and honest. Elijah stood behind it, one hand resting on a crate of baling wire. He was talking to an older man about fence posts, nothing urgent. But the moment he saw Clara, his words slowed. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, but he stepped aside, leaving room beside him. She approached, heart steady, back straight. The sun broke through cloud just then, glinting off the silver buckle of her belt. A few heads turned. She didn't look at them. She stood beside Elijah, silent. He handed her a folded cloth without a word, new calico, plum-colored and soft. Her fingers brushed his. Someone whispered near the bread stall. A child pointed. Two women stared openly, then leaned together like cattails in the wind. Clara heard it all. Let it pass through her like water. Elijah didn't shift away, didn't clear his throat, just stood next to her, like she was someone meant to be there. And in that moment, without touch, without declaration, a line was drawn, not for the town, for her. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she didn't feel like a shadow in Redstone. She felt seen, and stood beside a man who did not flinch. The fire crackled low inside Elijah's cabin, fed with cedar he'd split earlier that morning. Outside, night folded itself over the mountains, sky deep with stars. No sounds but the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind moving through pine. Clara sat in the worn rocker near the hearth, shawl around her shoulders, hands folded tight in her lap. The tart tin, empty but clean, sat on the small table beside her. She'd brought another that evening, peach this time. Left it like before, but he'd found her before she could leave. Stay a while, he'd said, simply. So she had. Now, the fire softened the shadows, and his presence filled the quiet, not loud, not looming, just solid. Elijah poured her a mug of tea and handed it over without brushing her fingers. No unnecessary contact. He knew the language of silence well enough not to crowd it. After a long pause, he said, I know what they say about you. She looked up slowly. I hear it in the store, in the street. Folks talk like their tongues are clean and their hearts are pure. He sat across from her, not too close. But I don't listen to any voice that can't carry weight. Clara's throat tightened. The tea cooled in her hands. I'm not who I was, she said finally. What they say, it's not all wrong, but it's not all of me. I never thought it was. She met his eyes then, held them. I was touched without kindness, blamed for it, shoved out of towns like refuse. I'm tired of proving I didn't ask for it. You don't have to prove anything to me. The words settled like snow on her chest, not warm, not dramatic, just true. She breathed in once, then exhaled. You've never asked me about it. Why? Elijah leaned forward, elbows on knees, firelight painting his face in copper tones. Because you're here now. That's the part that matters to me. Something in her cracked, but it wasn't pain, it was release. Slowly, carefully, she stood, took one step closer. Her fingers reached for his, not for reassurance, but for choice. He let her, didn't pull, didn't press. When she leaned in, he met her halfway. The kiss was quiet, like all things between them, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't trembling. She was home. Please, don't lift my skirt, she begged, but the preacher did, and lost his faith right there. By late May, the snow was only a memory in the mountains, clinging to distant peaks like a secret the land no longer needed to share. In the valley, redstone bloomed in fits, cherry trees shaking off blossom petals, wild grass rising through the fence posts. Clara stood barefoot in Elijah's garden, the hem of her dress tucked into her belt, dirt smudged across her forearms. The plot wasn't much, just a small square behind the cabin, cordoned with old rope and new stakes. But it was theirs. They'd turned the soil together 2 weeks earlier, Elijah silent and steady, Clara kneeling with her sleeves rolled high, and jaw set. That day, he'd handed her the seed packet: lettuce, carrots, squash, and let her choose what went where. Now, seedlings had begun to break through the soil. Clara knelt beside them, pressing her finger gently into the dirt. Not too deep, not too shallow, just enough. Elijah was fixing the fence nearby, hammering without rush. He worked like he loved her, unobtrusive, precise, always near. Every so often, he'd pause and glance over, not with ownership, but admiration, and maybe something softer. They didn't speak much about plans. There was no proposal, no ceremony, no dramatic moment of decision, just shared mornings and mended linens. 2 toothbrushes in a tin cup, her shawl always folded on the hook beside his coat. Quiet agreements passed between glances and gestures. One evening, he came inside with a scrap of wood under his arm. She looked up from her stitching. I carved something. She raised a brow. He set it on the table. It was a sign, rough but careful. Clara's stitching room. She stared at it, throat working, unable to speak. I cleared out the back room, he said, scratching his neck. Sun comes through good in the afternoon. The tears came before she could stop them, hot, fast, grateful. He stepped close, placed a hand on her back, just between her shoulder blades. She leaned into him without hesitation. They hadn't spoken of marriage, but they'd spoken of a shelf for her jars, a rocker for her reading, a window facing east in redstone. They were still whispered about, but here, between the garden and the fence line, no one else's voice mattered. Their home was being built not with nails and wood, but with steady love and shared mornings. The wedding was not announced in the chapel. There was no preacher, no lace, no pews full of onlookers waiting to murmur approval or disapproval, no veil to lift, no aisle to walk. Just the two of them standing beneath the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, the branches still budding green, leaves trembling gently in the wind. Elijah wore a clean shirt and the same boots he worked in. Clara's dress was pale gray, stitched by her own hand, each hem pressed flat with care, not flash. In her hair, a single sprig of dried lavender. No ring, no bouquet. Just her, whole. He held her hands in his, rough palms against her calloused ones, and looked her in the eye the way he always had, not trying to see through her, not past her, just seeing. I don't need vows, he said quietly. Only this. I'll never speak over your silence, and I'll never ask you to be anyone but who you already are. Clara swallowed hard. Her voice didn't rise above a whisper. I never thought I'd be wanted without being rewritten. He smiled, eyes soft. You were never unreadable, just misread. She let the words settle into her, into the marrow of her, then nodded. There was no kiss for show, just a slow step forward, her head against his chest, arms wrapped around his waist. The wind stirred, tugged her shawl gently, and she let it fall, freeing her shoulders as if to say, I don't need to hide anymore. That evening, they shared stew by lamplight and sat together in the rocker, his hand cradling hers. She read aloud from her old book of Psalms, her voice no longer reciting, but claiming. The cabin was quiet, warm. The fire crackled. The garden outside, unseen, grew softly in the dark. Before sleep, he whispered, You saved me, you know. She turned to face him. I didn't save anyone. You reminded me who I already was, and for the first time in years, Clara Emmett closed her eyes without bracing for the world. She had not been rescued. She had not been redeemed. She had simply been believed, and in that, she had found peace.